Inside a modest home, Kenneth and Sophia were busy preparing dinner. The aroma of jollof rice filled the air as they worked side by side, a comfortable silence between them. Kenneth, tall and easygoing, stirred the pot while Sophia, graceful and lively, set the table. "Ken, don't forget the pepper," Sophia reminded, smiling at her husband. "I got it, Sophia," Kenneth replied with a grin. "I like my food with a kick, remember?" Their light-hearted exchange was interrupted by a knock on the door. Sophia went to answer it and found Scott and Chinny, their closest friends. Scott, a confident man with an infectious laugh, held a bottle of wine. Chinny, his petite and calm wife, carried a basket of fresh fruit. "Ah, our favorite couple," Scott greeted, stepping inside. "We brought some wine to go with dinner." "Perfect timing as always," Kenneth said, welcoming them. The four friends gathered around the table, the room buzzing with conversation and laughter. They talked about work, the upcoming town festival, and the usual gossip. As the evening went on, the wine flowed, and their conversations grew more playful. "We need to do something different," Kenneth suggested, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "How about a game?" Chinny asked, intrigued. "What kind of game?" Kenneth hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, lowering his voice. "Something daring, like swapping partners for a night just for fun." There was a brief silence. Sophia and Chinny exchanged surprised glances while Scott's eyes lit up. "Are you serious, Kenny?" Scott asked, half laughing. "Why not?" Kenneth shrugged. "We're all friends here. Just one night. No harm done." Sophia looked at Kenneth, then at Scott and Chinny. The idea was outrageous, but the thrill of it was undeniable. After a moment, she nodded. "All right," Sophia agreed. "Let's try it." "To a night of adventure," Scott declared, raising his glass. "To adventure," the others echoed, clinking their glasses together. As they laughed, none of them could foresee how this simple game would change everything. The night was quiet, with only the distant sounds of crickets filling the air. Inside Scott and Chinny's home, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Sophia and Scott sat together in the living room, their laughter echoing as they shared stories and jokes, the initial awkwardness fading away. Scott poured more wine, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face. "I have to admit, I never thought we'd be doing this," Sophia said, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "Me neither," Scott replied, his smile warm. "But it's just for fun, right?" Sophia nodded, though her heart beat faster than she'd like to admit. There was a thrill in the air, a sense of the forbidden that made her feel alive. Scott leaned closer, his voice low. "Can I tell you a secret?" he whispered. "Go on," Sophia replied, her curiosity piqued. "I've always found you attractive, Sophia." "From the first day Kenneth introduced us," Scott confessed, his eyes locking with hers. Sophia felt a rush of heat to her cheeks, unsure how to respond. She looked at Scott, his gaze intense and sincere. Without thinking, she leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was both unexpected and electrifying. The world seemed to fade away as they gave in to the moment, the wine and the thrill of the game taking over. Meanwhile, in Kenneth and Sophia's home, Chinny and Kenneth were having a different kind of night. They sat in the kitchen, talking about work and life, the easy friendship between them making the night feel comfortable. "So you and Scott, how do you do it?" Kenneth asked, pouring Chinny another drink. "You always seem so happy." Chinny smiled, her eyes thoughtful. "It's not always easy, Ken, but we talk, we share everything. Even when we fight, we make sure to make up. It's about understanding, you know?" Kenneth nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I think Sophia and I could learn a thing or two from you two. Sometimes I feel like we're just going through the motions." "It's normal, Kenneth. Every marriage has its ups and downs, but you have to keep trying, keep finding ways to connect," Chinny advised. Kenneth smiled, grateful for her words. The night passed peacefully, the conversation flowing until they both fell asleep on the couch, comfortable in the presence of a trusted friend. The next morning, Sophia and Scott woke up, reality setting in as the thrill of the night before faded. They parted ways with a promise to keep the night a secret, both feeling a mix of excitement and guilt. As Sophia returned home, she found Kenneth and Chinny still asleep on the couch. She smiled at the sight, relieved that her husband seemed content. But as she went about her day, she couldn't shake the thoughts of Scott. The memory of his touch, his kiss, lingered in her mind, and she found herself longing for more. Scott, too, was lost in thought. As he went about his day, he found himself distracted, his mind drifting back to Sophia. He had enjoyed their time together, the way she made him feel. There was a connection between them that he couldn't ignore, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to feel it again. That evening, as the couples met up for dinner, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Kenneth and Chinny chatted easily, oblivious to the undercurrents between Sophia and Scott. Sophia caught Scott's eye across the table, a silent question in her gaze. Scott nodded slightly, understanding what she was asking. As the night went on, Sophia and Scott found themselves alone in the kitchen, the others in the living room. "We need to talk," Sophia whispered, her voice shaking. "I know," Scott replied, his voice low. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sophia. Last night it was more than just a game for me." "Me too," Sophia admitted, her heart pounding. "But what do we do now? We can't keep doing this." Scott took her hand, his eyes serious. "We'll figure it out, but I know I want to see you again. Just you and me." Sophia hesitated, torn between the thrill of their secret and the guilt she felt. But the pull of desire was strong, and the thought of another night like the last was too tempting to resist. "All right," she agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Scott promised, a smile spreading across his face. "We'll be careful." As they rejoined Kenneth and Chinny, both felt the weight of their secret, the thrill of the game now turning into a dangerous dance. The line between excitement and disaster was thin, and they were already balancing on the edge. Days turned into weeks, and life continued its steady rhythm. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Kenneth and Sophia went about their daily routines, while Scott and Chinny did the same. The two couples still met regularly, sharing meals and laughter, maintaining the appearance of close friendship. But beneath the surface, things were changing. Sophia and Scott's secret meetings had become more frequent, the attraction between them impossible to ignore. They met in hidden corners of the town, places where no one would recognize them. Each encounter left them wanting more, their feelings deepening with every stolen moment. One afternoon, Sophia found herself wandering the market. Her thoughts consumed by Scott, she browsed through stalls absent-mindedly, her mind replaying their last meeting. Suddenly, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Scott, a grin spreading across his face. "What are you doing here?" Sophia asked, surprised but secretly thrilled to see him. "Looking for you," Scott replied, his voice low. Sophia glanced around nervously, but the market was busy, and no one seemed to notice them. "We have to be careful, Scott," she whispered. "If anyone sees us." "No one will see us," Scott assured her, taking her hand. "Let's go somewhere private." They slipped away from the market, finding a secluded spot by the river, hidden by tall grasses. There, they kissed, the world around them fading away. For a moment, it was just the two of them, free from the constraints of reality. But as the sun began to set, they knew they had to part. "I wish we could stay like this forever," Sophia said, resting her head on Scott's shoulder. "Me too," Scott agreed, holding her close. "But we'll find a way, I promise." Back at home, Kenneth began to notice changes in Sophia. She was often distracted, lost in thought, and she seemed distant. At first, he brushed it off as stress, but as the days passed, he couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening after dinner, Kenneth decided to talk to Sophia. They sat on the porch, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves. "Sophia, is everything okay?" Kenneth asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Why do you ask?" Sophia replied, avoiding his gaze. "You've been different lately, distant. Is something bothering you?" Kenneth pressed gently. Sophia forced a smile, shaking her head. "No, nothing's wrong. I've just been tired, that's all." Kenneth nodded, though he wasn't convinced. There was something Sophia wasn't telling him, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Meanwhile, Chinny had noticed changes in Scott as well. He was coming home late more often, and when she asked him about it, he would brush her off with vague excuses. One night, as they lay in bed, she decided to confront him. "Scott, where do you go every evening?" Chinny asked, her voice steady but firm. "Just work, Chinny," Scott replied, turning away. "You know how it is." "No, I don't know," Chinny said, sitting up. "You've been acting strange, and I want to know why." Scott sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing, Chinny. You're overthinking things. I've just been busy." Chinny watched him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the truth. But Scott's expression was calm, giving nothing away. Reluctantly, she let it go, though doubt lingered in her mind. As the nights went on, both Kenneth and Chinny felt the unease growing. There was a distance between them and their spouses, a wall that hadn't been there before. The game that was supposed to bring excitement had left them feeling more alone than ever, each of them caught in a web of secrets they couldn't yet see. Sophia and Scott couldn't stop thinking about each other. The more they met in secret, the more they wanted to be together. They found new places to hide, an empty house at the edge of town, a quiet spot behind the old church. Each secret meeting deepened their connection, the thrill of deception making every moment more intoxicating. One afternoon, they met at the empty house. Sophia's heart pounded as she slipped inside. Scott was already waiting. "You're late," he teased, pulling her close. "I had to make sure no one saw me," Sophia replied with a mischievous smile. His expression turned serious. "Kenneth is getting suspicious, so is Chinny." "We have to be careful," she whispered, though the worry in her eyes was clear. "They won't find out," Scott assured her, pressing a kiss to her lips. "As long as we're careful, no one will ever know." For a while, nothing else mattered. They lost themselves in each other, in the illusion that their love existed outside the constraints of reality. But as the sun began to set, the weight of their choices returned. They had to go back to their lives, to their partners, to the town where whispers spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before those whispers reached Kenneth. As he walked to the market one day, a neighbor pulled him aside. "Kenneth, I need to tell you something," the man said cautiously, glancing around. "What is it?" Kenneth asked. "I saw Sophia with Scott the other day," the neighbor said in a hushed tone. "They were close. It didn't look right." Kenneth's stomach twisted. He had tried to ignore the signs, to convince himself it was all in his head, but hearing it from someone else made it real. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice strained. "I'm sure." Meanwhile, Chinny overheard two women gossiping in the market. They were by the river, laughing together like a couple, one woman said. "Married people don't spend that much time together unless something's going on," the other agreed. Chinny's chest tightened. She had trusted Scott, but doubt now gnawed at her. That night, she decided to confront him. Dinner at Kenneth and Sophia's house was eerily silent. The unspoken tension was suffocating. Finally, Kenneth broke it. "Sophia, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice measured but firm. "What is it?" she replied, feigning calm despite the panic creeping into her chest. "I heard something today," he said, "about you and Scott." Her breath hitched. "Kenneth, it's not what you think." "What am I supposed to think?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You've been distant, secretive, and now people are talking." Across town, Chinny was demanding answers from Scott. "I know you've been meeting Sophia," she accused, her eyes filled with hurt. "Why are you lying to me?" Scott sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Chinny, it's not like that. We were just talking." "Talking?" she scoffed. "You expect me to believe that? You've been sneaking around, and now everyone knows." Both arguments raged late into the night, accusations and denials tearing through once happy homes. The fragile secrecy of Sophia and Scott's affair was crumbling, and with it, the trust their partners had in them. Kenneth couldn't shake his suspicions. That night, he waited until Sophia was asleep and took her phone. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the messages. His worst fears were confirmed. They weren't just talking. Their words were filled with longing, with plans for secret rendezvous. The next morning, he confronted her. "Sophia, I know everything," he said coldly, holding up her phone. She froze. "Kenneth, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," he snapped. "You lied to me. You've been seeing him behind my back." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you." "Get out," he said, his voice void of emotion. "I can't look at you right now." Sophia left, her heart heavy with regret. Across town, Kenneth had already told Chinny everything. She too confronted Scott. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded through tears. Scott's face was filled with guilt. "I made a mistake. I never meant." "A mistake?" Chinny shot back. "You chose this." She packed her things and left. The thrill that had once fueled Sophia and Scott's affair had dissolved into nothing but heartbreak and destruction. A few days later, they met again at the empty house, now just a shadow of the refuge it once was. "What do we do now?" Sophia whispered. "I've lost Kenneth. You've lost Chinny. Was it worth it?" Scott sighed, running his hands through his hair. I don't know. I thought I loved you, but now. Silence stretched between them, heavy with regret. That night, unable to sleep, Kenneth wandered the streets. His thoughts were dark, his heart hollow. Somehow his feet led him to the empty house. He peered through a broken window and saw them. Together. Something in him snapped. Without thinking, he picked up a rock and hurled it through the glass. The window shattered, the sound slicing through the silence. Inside, Sophia and Scott startled. Kenneth? Sophia gasped. He stepped inside, rage burning in his eyes. You ruined my life, and now you'll pay for it. Chaos erupted. Kenneth lunged at Scott. They struggled, fists flying, furniture crashing. In the frenzy, Kenneth grabbed a knife from the kitchen. The blade met flesh. Silence fell. Scott collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. Sophia stood frozen, horror-stricken. Kenneth's breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of his actions sank in. What have I done? He whispered, his hands shaking. Sophia fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb as she dialed the police. Sirens wailed in the distance. Within minutes, Kenneth was arrested. The town reeled from the scandal. Scott, barely clinging to life, was rushed to the hospital. Sophia, shunned and broken, visited him. I'm so sorry, she whispered by his bedside. Kenneth's trial was swift. The evidence was damning. He was sentenced to prison. Sophia could no longer bear the weight of judgment, the constant stares, the whispered condemnations. She packed her things and left town, hoping to find solace elsewhere. Despite everything, Ginny reached out to her. The pain of betrayal ran deep, but in the wreckage, a small sliver of understanding remained. The affair that had once felt so exhilarating had led to devastation. Trust had been shattered, lives forever changed, and the town, forever scarred, had learned a brutal lesson. Some lines once crossed can never be undone.
Subscribe to our channel and turn on the bell notification for more stories like this, and give this video a thumbs up. Click on this next interesting story.